The Montana blizzard howled like a beast with vengeance in its heart. Eleanor Winters, her arthritic fingers clutching the porch railing, squinted through the whiteout. At 67, with Alzheimer's stealing more of her mind each day, she shouldn't have ventured outside. But something had called her, a sound beneath the wind's fury. There, a whimper so faint she thought she'd imagined it. Eleanor dropped to her knees, snow soaking through her flannel nightgown. Half buried in a drift lay a tiny bundle of fur, nearly blue with cold, not moving. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, a moment of perfect clarity cutting through her usual fog. As she scooped up the freezing puppy, its eyes fluttered open, startling blue, meeting hers with an ancient knowing that stopped her breath. "Not today," Eleanor murmured, cradling it against her chest. "Death doesn't get either of us today." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Eleanor Winters had once been among the most respected wildlife photographers in North America, her work appearing in National Geographic and countless conservation publications. That was before the diagnosis 2 years ago. Early onset Alzheimer's, the doctor had said, not meeting her eyes. Now, at 67, she battled an enemy that stole pieces of her mind with cruel randomness, leaving her intact enough to recognize what she was losing. Her cabin sat nestled against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. The nearest neighbor, 2 miles down a rutted dirt road that became impassable during the worst winter storms. The isolation that had once fueled her creativity now served as both protection and prison. Her late husband Robert had left her the property, his final gift ensuring she would always have a home, though he couldn't have foreseen how difficult that home would become to navigate alone. The cabin walls were papered with yellow sticky notes: "Take pills with breakfast," "Turn off stove," "Lock door at night." On good days, Eleanor found them unnecessary but comforting. On bad days, they were lifelines in a sea of confusion. The calendar in the kitchen had Tuesday's date circled in red, Martha's visit day. The home health aide came weekly, a tenuous connection to the outside world. Eleanor's son Richard lived in Chicago with his wife and children, calling every Sunday with the same gentle suggestion that grew less gentle each month. "Mom, we've found a nice assisted living facility, just 30 minutes from our house." Each time, Eleanor refused. She knew what those places meant, the end of whatever freedom remained. Her fingers, once steady enough to photograph wolves in full sprint, now trembled when holding a mug of tea. The camera equipment gathered dust on shelves, painful reminders of clarity and purpose. Her medications sat in the plastic organizer, each compartment representing one more day survived, though Medicare complications meant sometimes choosing between prescriptions and groceries. In her clearest moments, Eleanor recognized the irony. She, who had spent decades documenting the lives of wild creatures, was now herself observed, assessed, and managed. Her photo of the Yellowstone alpha female had captured the essence of wild dignity. Looking in the mirror, Eleanor wondered how much of her own dignity remained, and how much more she would surrender before the end. Still, on days when the mountains stood crisp against blue skies, when chickadees visited her feeder, Eleanor found reasons to continue fighting. She was not finished yet. Eleanor's hands trembled as she worked. She wrapped the tiny creature in towels warmed on the radiator, her movements slow but purposeful. The animal's breathing came in shallow pants, its eyes closed, body limp. Eleanor had seen enough wildlife in distress to recognize the edge of survival. This pup was barely clinging to life. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered, reaching for the heating pad she kept for her arthritic back. She adjusted the setting to low, created a nest of blankets in a cardboard box, and gently placed the puppy inside. Its fur was matted with snow and dirt, but even through the grime she could see an unusual paleness to the coat. Something about the pup's face triggered a memory. A spring morning in Yellowstone, 1996. The alpha female of the Rose Creek pack nursing her litter, while Eleanor photographed from a blind. The images had garnered her a National Geographic cover. The memory was so sharp, so clear against the usual fog of her mind, that Eleanor gasped. By morning, the puppy's condition had improved. It accepted drops of warm milk from an eyedropper, its tiny tongue lapping feebly. When it finally opened its eyes, Eleanor found herself staring into pools of striking pale blue that seemed to hold a wisdom beyond their weeks. "Ghost," she said, the name coming to her unbidden. "That's what I'll call you." Coming out of nowhere in that whiteout, like an apparition, Ghost recovered with remarkable speed. By the third day, he was wobbling around the kitchen floor. Within a week, he followed Eleanor everywhere, attuned to her movements in a way that seemed almost preternatural. When she stood staring into the refrigerator, forgetting what she needed, Ghost would sit patiently at her feet until clarity returned. On Tuesday, Martha arrived for her weekly visit, stamping snow from her boots at the door. "Miss Eleanor!" "What in heaven's name?" The home health aide stopped short at the sight of the puppy curled in Eleanor's lap as she rocked in her chair. "His name is Ghost," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than Martha had heard in months. "He was dying in the snow. I saved him." Martha's brow furrowed. "Miss Eleanor, you can barely remember to take your own medication. A puppy needs constant care." "I remember what needs remembering," Eleanor said stubbornly. "He keeps me company, keeps me present." After checking Eleanor's vital signs and ensuring she had taken her medications, Martha reluctantly agreed not to report the puppy to her supervisor. "But if I see you struggling next week, we'll need to find him another home." As the weeks passed, Eleanor began noticing peculiarities about Ghost. He grew at an astonishing rate, his paws oversized even for his expanding frame. His ears stood increasingly upright, his muzzle elongating. Most striking was his intelligence. He seemed to understand Eleanor's routines, her needs. Eleanor began keeping a journal documenting Ghost's development. On good days, her notes were detailed and scientific, echoing the observational skills of her former career. On bad days, they were scattered thoughts, sometimes unintelligible even to herself. Ghost's food costs strained Eleanor's fixed income. When it came time to refill her prescription, she found herself short $43. "I'll manage," she told herself, setting the refill aside. "Some things matter more." The first time Eleanor became disoriented outside the cabin, wandering toward the tree line, forgetting her purpose, Ghost appeared at her side, gently tugging her sleeve toward home. As she followed, clarity gradually returned. By the time they reached the porch, Eleanor realized what had happened and what Ghost had done. "You're watching out for me," she said wonderingly, kneeling, despite her aching knees, to look into those intelligent blue eyes. "Lord knows I need somebody, too." That night, Ghost slept at the foot of her bed, his warmth a comfort against the deepening winter chill and the colder fear of her dissolving mind. 3 months passed, and the Montana winter began its slow surrender to spring. Ghost was no longer the tiny bundle Eleanor had rescued from the snow. He'd grown with astonishing speed. now weighing nearly 60 pounds, with lanky legs, a thickening ruff around his neck, and unmistakable wolf-like features that became more pronounced each week. His movements had taken on a fluid grace, and occasionally Eleanor would catch him staring out the window toward the distant forests with an intensity that gave her pause. Despite Ghost's alarming growth rate, Eleanor's condition had stabilized. Her routine of caring for him, the regular feeding, grooming, and daily walks around the property, had imposed a structure that her declining mind embraced. On her clearest days, Eleanor suspected what Ghost truly was, but she pushed the knowledge away, focusing instead on how his presence steadied her, how his pale blue eyes would find her during moments of confusion, and somehow guide her back to herself. The knock on the door came on an unusually warm March afternoon. Eleanor opened it to find her son Richard standing on her porch, suitcase in hand, his expression shifting from a prepared smile to shock as Ghost appeared at Eleanor's side. "Mom?" Richard said carefully, his eyes fixed on the animal. "What is that?" "This is Ghost," Eleanor replied, her hand automatically finding the thick fur at Ghost's neck. "My dog." Richard stepped inside cautiously, his tall frame tense. At 42, he had his father's build, but Eleanor's eyes now narrowed with concern. "That's not a dog, Mom. That looks like a wolf." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. In her lucid moments, she had suspected, but hearing Richard say it aloud made the reality harder to deny. That evening, after a tense dinner, during which Ghost lay watchful in the corner, Richard confronted her directly. "How long have you had him? Where did he come from?" Eleanor explained about the blizzard night, the rescue. As she spoke, she felt the fog that often clouded her thoughts receding. She was more present than she had been in weeks, something that happened increasingly when she discussed Ghost. "He's dangerous, Mom. Even if he's not full wolf, he's clearly a high-content hybrid. He doesn't belong in a house, especially not with someone who—" Richard stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung between them. Someone who can't take care of herself, let alone a wild animal. The next morning, Richard arranged for their neighbor, Bill Henderson, to watch Ghost while he took Eleanor to her quarterly neurologist appointment in Missoula. Dr. Patricia Sandoval reviewed Eleanor's latest cognitive assessments with surprise. "Your test scores have stabilized since our last visit," she said, checking Eleanor's chart again. "That's unusual with your progression type. Have you made any significant lifestyle changes?" Eleanor started to mention Ghost, but Richard interjected. "She's been more active, getting outside more." On the drive home, Richard was quiet until they pulled onto the dirt road leading to Eleanor's cabin. "The doctor's right. You do seem better. But, Mom, that animal isn't a pet. It's not safe." "He helps me remember," Eleanor said simply. "When I'm with Ghost, I don't get lost in my own house." Richard sighed. "I need to show you something." That evening, after dinner, Richard retrieved a dusty box from Eleanor's attic. Inside were journals from her photography career, including detailed observations of wolf packs she had documented in the mid-1990s. Eleanor ran her fingers over her own handwriting, memories surfacing like treasures from deep water. "You were the expert, Mom," Richard said gently. "Read what you wrote about wolf behavior, about their needs and instincts. Ghost belongs in the wild. The next morning, Richard made a call to the local veterinarian, who agreed to examine Ghost. The vet's conclusion was unequivocal. This is a gray wolf, possibly with minimal dog ancestry, but I'd estimate at least 90% pure wolf, the vet explained, maintaining a cautious distance from Ghost, who remained unnervingly calm during the examination. He's around 5 months old based on tooth development, and he'll continue growing. Full-grown males can reach 130 pounds. Richard drove them home in silence. As they approached the cabin, he finally spoke. "Mom, I've made some calls. There's an assisted living facility near me in Chicago. It has an excellent memory care unit." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "No." "Then Ghost has to go." "I'm sorry, but I'm not leaving until this is resolved. I'll give you 2 weeks to find a sanctuary that will take him, or I'm calling Fish and Wildlife myself." That night, after Richard had gone to bed in the spare room, Eleanor sat on the porch with Ghost beside her. The moon cast silver light across the still, snowy landscape, and in the distance a pack of coyotes called to one another. "They want to separate us," she whispered, her hand buried in Ghost's thick fur. For the first time since she'd found him, Ghost made a sound in response. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, but something between that seemed to Eleanor like a promise. "You helped me remember who I am," she told him. "I won't let them take that away." Martha arrived the next day for her weekly visit, immediately sensing the tension in the cabin. Richard hovered nearby as she took Eleanor's blood pressure, his presence unusual during these routine checkups. "Your mother's vitals have improved since last month," Martha told him, packing away her stethoscope. "Her weight's up too, which we've been trying to achieve for some time." "Did you know about the wolf?" Richard asked bluntly. Martha's eyes flicked toward Ghost, who lay observing them from his place by the wood stove. "I knew she had taken in what she believed was a dog. I've been monitoring the situation." "And you didn't think to report it?" Martha straightened, meeting Richard's accusatory gaze directly. "Mr. Winters, I've been working with seniors for 22 years. Your mother has shown more engagement, better appetite, and improved orientation since that animal arrived. My job is her well-being. After Martha left, she made a call to the county's senior services coordinator, expressing concern that Eleanor Winters might be forced into an unnecessarily restrictive care environment, despite showing improvement in her home setting." That afternoon, Eleanor had a particularly clear spell. She found Richard examining her camera equipment, dusty from disuse. "The Nikon was your father's," she said. "The Canon was mine. I preferred how it captured movement." Richard looked up, surprised at her precision. These moments had become increasingly rare. "I remember you taking it everywhere." "Ghost brought back my camera case yesterday," Eleanor said, settling into a chair nearby. "I'd left it on the back porch. Forgot it was even mine until he dropped it at my feet." Richard frowned. "Mom, that's what concerns me. He's not a service animal. He's not even domesticated." "He retrieves my medicine when the alarm goes off," Eleanor continued, as if Richard hadn't spoken. "Leads me back to the cabin when I wander. Stays close on my bag days. It's still a wild animal that's growing larger every week." Their argument was interrupted by a truck pulling into the driveway, bearing the insignia of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. A tall man with weathered features and a close-cropped gray beard approached the cabin, his gait purposeful. "Miss Winters?" he called, knocking on the doorframe. Thomas Blackwood, wildlife officer. I've received reports of a possible wolf being kept as a pet on this property. Eleanor felt her mind clouding with sudden anxiety. Ghost pressed against her leg, steadying her. There must be some mistake, she began. But Richard stepped forward. I'm Richard Winters, Eleanor's son. The reports are accurate. We're making arrangements for the animal's relocation. Officer Blackwood's eyes narrowed as they fell on Ghost. Ma'am, keeping a wolf or wolf hybrid without proper permits is a violation of state regulations. That animal needs to be surrendered to wildlife authorities immediately. No, Eleanor said, her voice suddenly firm. He's not just an animal. He's... The fog descended again, words slipping away from her. Ghost pressed closer, and her hand found his fur automatically. Thomas Blackwood watched this interaction with an expression that went beyond professional concern. There was something personal in his scrutiny of Eleanor, something Richard couldn't identify but instantly distrusted. Do you even know who I am, Miss Winters? Blackwood asked, his tone carrying an edge. Eleanor looked at him blankly, then with frustration as recognition failed her. Should I? A muscle twitched in Blackwood's jaw. I'll return tomorrow with the proper transport equipment. That animal needs to be in a proper facility. After he left, Richard found Eleanor in her study, rifling through old files with uncharacteristic focus. Mom, what are you looking for? I know him, she muttered. I know that man. It's in here somewhere. That evening, Eleanor experienced an episode that frightened Richard. She became disoriented after dinner, insisting she needed to pack her camera gear for a dawn shoot, unable to recognize her son, or understand why she couldn't leave. Ghost remained at her side throughout, gently herding her away from the door when she tried to go outside in her nightgown. When the episode passed, Eleanor slept deeply. Richard, unable to rest, began looking through her journals, searching for any mention of Thomas Blackwood. Instead, he found himself engrossed in her detailed observations of wolf behavior, their social structures, their intelligence, their capacity for bonding with humans under specific circumstances. In one journal from 1996, he found a reference to experimental work being done with socialized wolves as part of a university research project. Eleanor had documented early efforts to understand if wolves raised with intensive human contact from birth could maintain both their wild instincts and ability to interact safely with humans. The program had been controversial, ultimately shut down after funding cuts and public opposition. Richard turned to her more personal journals, finding entries from the early stages of her disease. The fear in her usually precise handwriting was palpable. Forgot. Robert has been gone 3 years. Set the table for 2 again. And later, called Richard by his father's name today. The look on his face. I'm disappearing while still here. In the morning, Richard drove into town to meet with local veterinarian Dr. Sarah Jenkins, who had examined Ghost. There's something unusual about this wolf, she admitted after Richard pressed her. His comfort with humans, his attentiveness to your mother. It's not typical, even for a hand-raised wolf. Could he be part of a research program, something with specialized training? Dr. Jenkins considered this. It's possible. There's been interesting work done with animal therapy and dementia patients. Nothing with wolves that I know of, but dogs have shown remarkable results. Richard's next stop was the office of retired Judge William Montgomery, known locally for his expertise in wildlife law. The elderly jurist listened thoughtfully to Richard's explanation of the situation. Officer Blackwood is technically correct about the regulations, Montgomery said, adjusting his reading glasses. However, there are provisions for educational and research animals, and for certain therapy animals in extraordinary circumstances. Richard leaned forward. My mother was a leading wildlife photographer who documented wolf reintroduction. Now she has Alzheimer's, and this wolf is somehow helping her. Montgomery nodded slowly. That's a compelling narrative, son. But you'd need scientific documentation of the therapeutic benefit, professional assessment of the animal's temperament, and stringent safety protocols. And Thomas Blackwood, a complicated man, Montgomery said carefully, has personal history with wolf conservation programs, not all positive. When Richard returned to the cabin, he found Eleanor sitting at her old desk, a photograph album open before her. Ghost lay at her feet. "I remembered," she said without looking up. "Thomas Blackwood. His father was John Blackwood, a field assistant on the Yellowstone Reintroduction Project." Richard sat across from her. "What happened to him?" "Attacked during a tracking expedition. I was there, photographing. The wolf was defending her den. John got too close." Eleanor's voice was steady, her memory clear. "He survived, but never walked properly again." Thomas was just a teenager then. "Did Thomas blame you?" "He blamed all of us involved in the program. Said we valued wolves over human lives." Eleanor turned a page in the album, revealing photographs of wolf pups being examined by researchers. These were from the University of Montana research project, studying wolf socialization, intelligence. Richard studied the images. "Mom, do you think Ghost could be connected to that program somehow?" Eleanor looked down at Ghost, who gazed back at her with those striking blue eyes. "I don't know, but he understands me in a way no one else does anymore." That afternoon, Martha returned with Lisa Chen, the county's senior services coordinator. They conducted an evaluation of Eleanor's living situation and cognitive functioning. "Mrs. Winters shows significantly better recall and orientation in her home environment than would be expected given her diagnosis," Lisa noted, watching as Eleanor confidently prepared tea for them. "Forced relocation could trigger rapid decline." "The wolf is the issue," Richard explained. "Officer Blackwood is returning tomorrow to remove him." Lisa and Martha exchanged glances. "The animal appears to be functioning as an unofficial therapy assistant," Lisa observed. "There are precedents for unconventional support animals, though usually with formal training." "Could we get some kind of exception? A special permit?" "Possibly," Lisa said, "but you'd need compelling evidence of therapeutic benefit, and quickly." That evening, the local news featured a segment on innovative therapies for dementia patients, including animal-assisted programs. Richard watched with growing interest as a neurologist explained how regular interaction with support animals had shown measurable benefits for cognitive function and emotional well-being in some patients. As the deadline approached, tension in the cabin mounted. Eleanor alternated between remarkable clarity and profound confusion. During her clear periods, she worked with Richard to document Ghost's behaviors and her own improvements. During the confused episodes, Ghost remained her constant companion, sometimes leading her gently back to the present with nudges and patient attention. The property tax notice arrived that morning, overdue by 2 months, with a warning of potential lien proceedings. Richard added it to the growing pile of financial concerns his mother had been unable to manage. "We need to talk about money, Mom," he said gently during breakfast. "I'm not selling the cabin," she replied immediately, surprising him with her sharpness. "I'm not suggesting that. But we need to address these bills and your medication costs." Eleanor looked away. "I've been managing by skipping doses," Richard said, having discovered her partially filled pill organizer. "That's not sustainable." Ghost entered from the porch, moving to Eleanor's side. Richard watched as her hand automatically reached to touch the wolf's head, her agitation visibly easing. "I need him, Richard," she said simply. "When everything else slips away, he brings me back." Later that day, Dr. Sarah Jenkins arrived with equipment to conduct a more thorough examination of Ghost. To everyone's surprise, the wolf submitted calmly to the procedures, maintaining a protective position near Eleanor throughout. "I've consulted with colleagues at the University of Montana," Dr. Jenkins explained, as she collected DNA samples. "There's growing interest in studying unusual human-animal bonds, particularly in therapeutic contexts. Your mother's case could be significant." As sunset approached, Richard stood on the porch, watching snow begin to fall again. The deadline loomed. Thomas Blackwood would return in the morning. Despite their efforts, they had no legal guarantee that Ghost wouldn't be taken. Inside, he could see Eleanor sitting in her rocking chair, Ghost at her feet. She was speaking to the wolf in low tones, her hand rhythmically stroking his fur. In that moment, Richard realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a connection that transcended conventional understanding, bridging the gap between species, and somehow keeping his mother tethered to herself, despite the disease trying to take her away. His decision crystallized. Whatever it took, he would fight to keep them together. The weather forecasters had predicted clear skies, but Montana's mountains kept their own counsel. By midnight, heavy snowfall had begun, and by dawn nearly 8 inches blanketed Eleanor's property, with more falling steadily. The late-season blizzard brought with it a momentary reprieve. Officer Blackwood would be delayed by treacherous road conditions. Richard awoke to find his mother already dressed, standing at the kitchen window with unusual alertness, Ghost at her side. "I need to count my pills," Eleanor announced. "Something isn't right with them." Richard watched as she methodically opened her medication organizer, frowning at the contents. "There should be more. The blue ones for memory, they're almost gone." "We can get them refilled," Richard assured her, making a mental note to call her doctor that morning. The snow might delay Blackwood, but it also complicated their access to the pharmacy in town. By midday, the storm had intensified. Richard tried calling Judge Montgomery for last-minute advice, but found phone service intermittent at best. The isolation that had attracted Eleanor to this property now worked against them, cutting off potential support when they needed it most. "My head feels clearer today," Eleanor remarked as they shared lunch. "Like someone swept away the cobwebs." Richard nodded, noticing how she maintained her train of thought, how her hands moved with purpose rather than hesitation. These windows of lucidity had become more frequent since Ghost's arrival, a correlation he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. By afternoon, Eleanor's medication situation had become concerning. The prescription bottle for her primary Alzheimer's medication was empty, and her cognitive enhancement pills were down to just 2 doses. "I'll drive into town," Richard decided, looking out at the relentless snowfall with apprehension. "We can't wait." "No," Eleanor protested. "The roads'll be impassable by now. I've lived here long enough to know." She was right. But the alternative was watching his mother's tenuous clarity fade as her medication ran out. Richard paced the cabin, torn between impossible options. "I've managed before," Eleanor said, misreading his concern. "I can stretch the doses." As evening approached, the temperature plummeted further. Richard stoked the wood stove while Eleanor prepared a simple dinner. Ghost had been unusually restless all day, moving between windows, ears perked at sounds beyond human hearing. It happened during the brief moment when Richard stepped outside to bring in more firewood. Eleanor, alone in the kitchen, experienced a sudden, severe disorientation, worse than anything she'd felt in weeks. The familiar room became foreign territory. She couldn't remember what she was doing, or why she held a knife in her hand. Panic seized her. A single coherent thought broke through. She needed to photograph the wolves. They were waiting for her at the ridge. Robert had scouted the location yesterday. Eleanor put down the knife, moved to the coat rack, and pulled on her parka. Ghost appeared beside her, whining softly, but in her confusion, she didn't recognize him. When he tried blocking her path to the door, she simply moved around him. "Robert will be waiting," she murmured, stepping out into the blinding snow without boots, her medication forgotten on the counter. Richard returned to find the door ajar, Ghost frantically pacing between it and him, whining with distress. "Mom?" Richard called, setting down the firewood. No answer came from inside. "Mom!" Louder now, panic rising as he rushed through the empty cabin. Footprints in the fresh snow led away from the porch, already being filled by falling snow. Eleanor had perhaps 10 minutes head start, an eternity in these conditions. "Stay here," Richard commanded Ghost as he grabbed a flashlight and his coat. The wolf ignored him, bolting past into the snow, nose to the ground, following Eleanor's scent. Richard followed Ghost, the flashlight's beam barely penetrating the thick curtain of snowflakes. The temperature had dropped to single digits, and the wind cut through his layers like a knife. If Eleanor had left without proper clothing, Ghost moved with purpose, leading Richard toward the tree line. The fresh snow reached midway up Richard's calves, making progress laborious. He called his mother's name repeatedly, each shout swallowed by the howling wind. 20 minutes into their search, Ghost suddenly changed direction, veering sharply toward a dense stand of pines. Richard struggled to follow, slipping on hidden rocks beneath the snow. When he finally caught up, he found Ghost standing over a dark shape half buried in a snowdrift. Eleanor lay curled on her side, her parka dusted white, her hands bare and already showing the waxy pallor of advancing hypothermia. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, her breathing shallow. "Mom! Mom, can you hear me?" Richard knelt beside her, frantically brushing snow from her body. She didn't respond. He needed to get her warm immediately, but the cabin was at least 15 minutes away in these conditions, too long. Richard pulled off his outer coat to wrap around her, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Ghost, who had been circling them anxiously, suddenly lay down next to Eleanor, pressing his warm body against hers. Richard understood instantly and positioned Eleanor more securely against the wolf's bulk, then added his coat as an outer layer. "Good boy," he whispered, voice breaking. "Keep her warm." Ghost threw his head back and released a long, mournful howl that echoed through the forest. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound carried through the storm with preternatural clarity. Richard, focused on monitoring Eleanor's breathing, barely registered the significance of this behavior. 10 minutes passed. Eleanor's condition unchanged. Richard began calculating whether he should attempt to carry her back to the cabin or continue waiting for her to stabilize. Ghost remained motionless except for his occasional glances toward the direction of the main road. Then came an answering sound, not a howl, but the distant rumble of an engine. Minutes later, headlights pierced the gloom, and a Forest Service truck appeared, moving slowly along the barely visible access road. Thomas Blackwood emerged from the vehicle, his expression transforming from determination to shock as he took in the scene before him, Richard kneeling in the snow, Eleanor unconscious, and Ghost lying protectively beside her. "I heard howling," Blackwood said, moving quickly toward them with an emergency blanket from his truck. "Thought it might be a wolf in distress." Together, they wrapped Eleanor in the thermal blanket while Ghost continued to press against her, providing critical body heat. Blackwood assessed her condition with experienced efficiency. "Moderate to severe hypothermia. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." They carried Eleanor to Blackwood's truck, which was equipped with four-wheel drive and snow chains. Ghost jumped into the back without invitation, positioning himself next to Eleanor as Richard cradled her head in his lap. "The animal stays with her for now," Blackwood said, when Richard expected him to object. "Body heat is what she needs most." As they inched down the mountain toward the nearest hospital in Missoula, Eleanor began to stir, her eyes fluttering open during a moment of clarity. "The wolves," she murmured. "I needed to photograph them at dawn." "It's okay, Mom," Richard soothed. "We're getting you help." Her gaze drifted to Ghost, then to Blackwood driving. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "John's boy," she said clearly. "Thomas." Blackwood's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. At the hospital, Eleanor was quickly admitted to the emergency department. Ghost created an immediate stir among the medical staff, but in the crisis, no one objected to his presence in the ambulance bay. When they finally separated him from Eleanor at the hospital doors, he sat stoically with Richard in the waiting room, both of them snow-covered and exhausted. Hours passed before the doctor emerged with news. "We've stabilized her temperature and started her on her medication regimen. She's responding well, but this was a close call. Without intervention, she likely wouldn't have survived another hour in those conditions." "Can I see her?" Richard asked. "Briefly. She's sedated but conscious." Eleanor lay, small and fragile under hospital blankets, an IV in her arm, monitors beeping steadily beside her. When Richard entered, her eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in days. "Ghost saved me," she stated simply. "Yes, he did," Richard agreed, taking her hand. "And so did Officer Blackwood." A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "They'll take Ghost away now, won't they?" "Not if I can help it," Richard promised. As dawn broke, Thomas Blackwood entered the hospital waiting room where Richard had spent the night. Ghost, who had been allowed to remain due to extraordinary circumstances and the intervention of a sympathetic security guard, raised his head, but made no move toward the officer. "Your mother is stable," Blackwood said, removing his hat. "The doctor says she can be released tomorrow, but they want her under observation for at least 24 hours. "Thank you for finding us," Richard said. "I don't understand how you knew where to look." Blackwood's weathered face revealed nothing. "The wolf called," I answered. He hesitated, then added, "I've made arrangements for the wolf to be transported to the wildlife sanctuary in Helena this afternoon." Richard stood. "Officer Blackwood, that animal saved my mother's life last night." "I'm aware," Blackwood replied, his tone softening slightly. That's why I'm taking him to a sanctuary instead of authorizing euthanasia, which would be standard procedure for a wolf this habituated to humans. As they stood at an impasse, Dr. Sarah Jenkins arrived, having been called by Richard during the night. "I have preliminary results from Ghost's DNA testing," she announced without preamble, "and I think you'll both want to hear what I've found." Eleanor remained in the hospital for observation, while Ghost was transported to the Northern Rockies Wildlife Sanctuary outside Helena. The separation, though deemed necessary by all parties involved, proved immediately devastating for both. "Your mother's cognitive function is declining rapidly," Dr. Melissa Carrington, the neurologist assigned to Eleanor's case, explained to Richard on the second day. "Her disorientation is increased, and she's showing significant agitation." Richard had witnessed this deterioration firsthand. Eleanor repeatedly asked for Ghost, sometimes lucid enough to understand he'd been taken away, other times believing he was simply in another room. During her worst episodes, she didn't recognize Richard at all, calling him Robert, or sometimes names of colleagues from decades past. "We've adjusted her medication," Dr. Carrington continued, "but pharmaceuticals can only do so much. The emotional component of Alzheimer's is often underestimated." The hospital staff had placed Eleanor in a private room within their newly renovated geriatric wing. The walls were painted in soothing colors, the lighting carefully calibrated to reduce confusion. None of it seemed to help. Eleanor paced when allowed up, pulled at her IV when confined to bed, and twice attempted to leave the building to find her wolf. Meanwhile, at the sanctuary, Ghost was exhibiting equally concerning behavior. Maggie Townsend, the facility's director, called Richard on the third day. "He's refusing food," she reported, worry evident in her voice. "And he's vocalizing constantly, not quite howling, but a sound I've never heard a wolf make before. Almost like he's calling for someone." "My mother," Richard said quietly. "We've placed him in our rehabilitation enclosure. It's 5 acres, with natural features, completely secure. But he just paces the perimeter, doesn't rest, doesn't interact with enrichment items. This isn't sustainable." Richard hung up and sat heavily in the chair beside his mother's hospital bed. Eleanor was finally sleeping, the result of a mild sedative prescribed when her agitation had become unmanageable. Her face, even in sleep, appeared troubled. Lines of distress etched around her mouth. On the 4th day, Thomas Blackwood arrived unexpectedly at the hospital. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of Eleanor's room, hat in hands, his usual stern demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine concern. "How is she?" he asked Richard. "Declining," Richard replied simply. "And Ghost?" "Not good," Blackwood admitted. "I visited the sanctuary yesterday. Never seen a wolf behave that way." A silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of Eleanor's heart monitor. Finally, Blackwood spoke again. "I need to tell you something about my father and your mother." Richard followed him to the small hospital courtyard where patients sometimes took air. The early spring day was brisk but sunny, crocuses pushing through the remnants of snow in the garden beds. "My father didn't just work on the wolf reintroduction project," Blackwood began. "He was obsessed with it. When he was attacked, he'd gone beyond protocol, approaching a den site alone during a sensitive period." He paused, the admission clearly difficult. "The official report blamed the wolf, but the truth is he ignored every safety procedure they'd established." "And you blamed my mother?" "I blamed everyone involved with the project. I was 17, angry. Your mother tried to reach out, sent letters, called. I rejected every attempt." Blackwood's weathered face reflected decades-old regret. When I became a wildlife officer, I told myself it was to protect people from what happened to my father. The truth was more complicated. Richard absorbed this information, understanding now the personal vendetta that had fueled Blackwood's determination to remove Ghost. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I saw something in that storm that changed my perspective," Blackwood replied. "That wolf, Ghost, he wasn't acting wild. He was protecting her. And the way he howled." He shook his head, unable to articulate what had moved him about the sound. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse hurrying into the courtyard. "Mr. Winters? Your mother is asking for you. She's quite upset." Richard found Eleanor sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face, more present than she had been in days. "They have him in a cage," she said when Richard entered. "I can feel it. He's calling for me." Richard took her hand. "Mom, Ghost is at a sanctuary. It's not exactly a cage. It's still confinement," she interrupted. "He saved my life, Richard. And he's saving my mind. You've seen it." Her grip on his hand tightened with surprising strength. "Without him, I'm disappearing faster." The hospital's psychiatric consultant was called in that afternoon. After evaluating Eleanor, he delivered his assessment bluntly. "Mrs. Winters exhibits classic signs of institutional transfer trauma, compounded by her Alzheimer's. The emotional attachment to the animal appears to have been serving as an anchor for her cognitive function. Without it, she's decompensating rapidly." "What do you recommend?" Richard asked. "Typically, we'd adjust medications, provide therapy, eventually recommend placement in memory care." The psychiatrist hesitated. "But I've reviewed Dr. Jenkins' preliminary research proposal regarding animal therapy for dementia patients. There may be merit in exploring that avenue, unconventional as it seems in this case." That evening, Richard received a call from Dr. Sarah Jenkins. "Ghost's DNA results are fascinating," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "He shares genetic markers with wolves from the original Yellowstone reintroduction, specifically descendants of the Rose Creek pack that your mother documented extensively." "What does that mean?" "It's possible Ghost is descended from wolves your mother studied decades ago. More importantly, the University of Montana is very interested in our findings. They've expressed preliminary support for a supervised study on animal therapy for dementia patients." Richard felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by reality. "That's good news for future patients, but it doesn't help my mother now. She's fading without Ghost, and he's deteriorating without her." The next morning brought more concerning news. Maggie from the sanctuary called in a panic. "Ghost broke through the inner partition of his enclosure last night. We contained him in the perimeter fencing, but he injured himself trying to escape. We've had to sedate him for treatment." Richard made an immediate decision. "I'm coming to get him." "You can't," Maggie objected. "It's not legally possible without—" "I'll handle the legal issues," Richard interrupted. "My mother is dying. Not just her mind now, but her will to live. I'm not going to let that happen if there's any alternative." When he arrived at the hospital afterward, he found Eleanor had been moved to the intensive care unit. Her doctor met him in the hallway, expression grave. "Your mother has stopped taking food and liquids. She's refusing medication. We can insert a feeding tube, but in her current state of distress, restraints would be necessary." The doctor looked genuinely pained. "Given her diagnosis, we need to discuss end-of-life directives and whether aggressive intervention aligns with her wishes." Richard stood in the doorway of the ICU, watching his once vibrant mother lying small and still in the hospital bed, tethered to monitors and IV lines. The woman who had tracked wolf packs through Yellowstone winters, who had published books and won awards, was disappearing before his eyes, not just to Alzheimer's now, but to heartbreak. In that moment, he knew conventional wisdom had failed them both. The university archives were housed in a modern building at the edge of the University of Montana campus. Richard sat at a polished oak table, surrounded by boxes of his mother's professional papers, donated years earlier, but rarely accessed. Dr. Sarah Jenkins had arranged for emergency access, bypassing the usual request procedures in light of Eleanor's critical condition. "Your mother was more significant in wildlife conservation than I realized," Dr. Jenkins said, carefully turning pages of a field journal from 1995. "These observations of wolf social behavior were groundbreaking at the time." Richard nodded absently, focused on a different folder labeled Socialization Study, Restricted Access. Inside were detailed notes and photographs documenting an experimental program that had briefly explored whether wolves raised with intensive human contact from birth could retain their wild instincts while developing the capacity for safe human interaction. "This was controversial," he murmured, scanning Eleanor's meticulous notes. They were trying to understand the boundaries between wild and domestic. The program was shut down after 2 years, Dr. Jenkins confirmed. Public opposition, funding cuts, and concerns about wolf conservation optics. But the scientific data was fascinating. The wolves demonstrated remarkable cognitive flexibility and bonding capacity. A particular photograph caught Richard's attention. A female wolf with distinctive pale fur and unusual blue eyes being examined by researchers. The caption identified her as Aurora, F2 generation, Rose Creek lineage. "Look at this," Richard said, pushing the photograph toward Dr. Jenkins. "The resemblance to Ghost is striking." Dr. Jenkins examined the image carefully. "The genetic testing confirms Ghost shares markers with the Rose Creek pack. He could be a direct descendant of this particular wolf. But that doesn't explain his behavior toward my mother." "Perhaps not entirely," she agreed. "But wolves have complex social intelligence and remarkable scent memory. If Ghost descended from wolves your mother worked with closely—" Richard shook his head. "It sounds too fantastic. More fantastic than a wolf saving your mother in a blizzard? Than her cognitive function improving in his presence?" Dr. Jenkins smiled slightly. "Science often begins by observing phenomena we don't yet understand." Their research was interrupted by a call from the hospital. Eleanor's condition had stabilized physically, but her psychological state remained precarious. The attending physician was recommending transfer to a specialized memory care facility, where her refusal of food and medication could be more aggressively managed. As Richard drove back to the hospital, his mind raced. The academic evidence of his mother's pioneering work might interest researchers, but it did nothing to address the immediate crisis. Ghost remained sedated at the sanctuary, Eleanor withdrawn in her hospital bed, and the legal barriers to reuniting them seemed insurmountable. When he arrived at the hospital, Richard was surprised to find Thomas Blackwood sitting in the waiting area outside Eleanor's room. "Any change?" Blackwood asked, rising from his chair. "They want to transfer her to a memory care unit. Once that happens—" Richard didn't finish the sentence. They both understood that such a move would likely end any possibility of Eleanor seeing Ghost again. Blackwood nodded grimly. "I've been making calls. Judge Montgomery thinks there might be a legal pathway, but it's complicated. We're running out of time. I know. Blackwood hesitated. I visited the sanctuary this morning. Ghost isn't doing well. The vet is concerned. Richard felt a surge of frustration. This is absurd. Both of them are suffering needlessly because of bureaucratic rules that never anticipated this situation. I agree, Blackwood said, surprising Richard. That's why I've spoken with my department supervisor. I've officially recused myself from the case due to personal connection. Personal connection? Blackwood looked uncomfortable. I told him about my father's history with your mother's research project, about my bias in the matter. This admission, clearly difficult for the proud officer, shifted something in Richard's perception. Thank you for that. Don't thank me yet, Blackwood replied. There's still the matter of state wildlife regulations. But I may have found something useful in your mother's research papers that we archived at Fish and Wildlife. He pulled out a folder containing photocopies of official documents from 25 years earlier. Your mother was granted special research privileges during the university study. Some of these authorizations were remarkably broad and what? And they never technically expired. Hope flickered in Richard's chest for the first time in days. What exactly does that mean? It means there might be a precedent for a research exemption. If we can demonstrate legitimate scientific value in the relationship between your mother and Ghost. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Carrington, Eleanor's neurologist. Mr. Winters, I've been reviewing your mother's case with colleagues at Northwestern's Cognitive Health Center. They're quite interested in the reported correlation between the animal's presence and her cognitive function. Richard introduced Thomas Blackwood, explaining his role in the situation. Officer Blackwood, I understand the wildlife regulations involved, Dr. Carrington said, but I need to emphasize that from a medical perspective, the separation is having measurable detrimental effects. Mrs. Winters' brain scans show increased deterioration patterns in the past week alone. Can you document that officially? Blackwood asked. Of course. Would that help? It might, Blackwood said, especially if coupled with research authorization. Within hours, an extraordinary collaboration had formed. Dr. Jenkins arrived with the university research proposal. Judge Montgomery joined by phone to advise on legal strategy. Dr. Carrington prepared medical documentation emphasizing the unusual therapeutic relationship. Maggie Townsend from the sanctuary provided detailed observations of Ghost's behavior, focusing on his apparent capacity for caregiving responses. Eleanor, unaware of these efforts, continued her slow decline. When Richard visited that evening, she was awake but distant, her gaze fixed on the window. Mom, he said gently, taking her hand, we're working on bringing Ghost back to you. Her eyes flickered toward him, a brief spark of recognition. He was calling for me. I heard him. I know, Mom. He misses you too. For a moment, clarity sharpened her features. William Blake wrote that animals are extensions of our senses. They see what we've forgotten how to see. She squeezed his hand. Ghost remembers me, even when I forget myself. The next morning, Richard met with the hospital's ethics committee, presenting their unusual proposal. The committee's chair, Dr. Leonard Abrams, listened with skeptical attention. Let me understand, he said when Richard finished. You want us to authorize bringing a wild wolf into a medical facility to assess its therapeutic effect on your mother? Ghost has been examined by wildlife veterinarians and behavioral specialists, Richard explained. He's currently sedated and could be transported safely. We're proposing a controlled interaction in the hospital's garden courtyard, fully secured with trained personnel present. Dr. Abrams frowned.
The liability issues alone
"Are addressed in these waivers," Judge Montgomery interjected, sliding documents across the table. "And the research authorization provides legal framework for the interaction." The debate continued for nearly an hour. Finally, Dr. Abrams sighed. "I've been practicing medicine for 37 years, and I have never encountered a situation quite like this one." He looked at each person around the table. "But I've also seen enough to know that sometimes unconventional approaches yield remarkable results." He signed the authorization form with a flourish. "You have 2 hours tomorrow morning. The courtyard will be secured, and hospital security will be present. If there's any sign of danger, any at all, this experiment ends immediately." As the committee dispersed, Dr. Jenkins approached Richard.
"There's one more piece of this puzzle I've been researching. Your mother's connection to Ghost might be more significant than we realized." She handed him a faded photograph she'd discovered in the university archives. It showed a much younger Eleanor kneeling beside a wolf den, carefully examining a litter of pups while their mother watched with unusual tolerance from nearby. "That's the Rose Creek alpha female," Dr. Jenkins explained. "Your mother was one of the few researchers she allowed near her pups. The scent memory in wolves is extraordinary, passed through generations. Some scientists believe wolves can recognize descendants of humans who interacted closely with their ancestors." Richard studied the photograph, the implications both strange and somehow fitting. "You're suggesting Ghost recognized my mother on some instinctive level?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Jenkins said carefully, "that there are connections in nature we're only beginning to understand. Tomorrow, we may witness one of them." 1 year later, the first snowfall of winter dusted Eleanor's cabin with a delicate white blanket. From the porch, she watched Ghost move through the clearing, his silver-gray coat almost disappearing against the wintry backdrop. At nearly 2 years old, he had grown into his full size, an imposing presence with intelligent blue eyes that never strayed far from Eleanor's location. "He's checking the perimeter," Eleanor explained to Martha, who had arrived for her now daily visit. "He always does that before the weather turns." Martha nodded, still marveling at the bond between woman and wolf. In the 12 months since the hospital courtyard reunion, a moment captured by Dr. Jenkins's assistant and subsequently shared in medical journals and beyond, Eleanor's condition had stabilized in ways that defied conventional medical expectations. Her cognitive decline hadn't reversed, but it had slowed significantly. More importantly, her quality of life had transformed from rapid deterioration to meaningful stability. "Richard called," Martha said, arranging Eleanor's medications in the Daily Organizer. "He'll be here this afternoon. Said he's bringing those university researchers again." Eleanor smiled. "Ghost enjoys the attention, shows off a bit." The dramatic courtyard reunion had indeed marked a turning point. When Ghost, carefully muzzled and handled by trained wildlife specialists, had been brought into the hospital garden where Eleanor waited, the transformation had been immediate and profound. Eleanor's vacant expression had sharpened into recognition. Ghost's sedation-dulled eyes had brightened. When allowed closer, Ghost had pressed his head gently against Eleanor's hand, and she had spoken his name with perfect clarity. The moment had convinced even the most skeptical observers that something exceptional was occurring, something that warranted further study rather than separation. Judge Montgomery had helped navigate the legal complexities, creating a precedent-setting arrangement that designated Ghost as both a research subject and therapeutic animal. Eleanor's property, with its isolated location and natural boundaries, became an official study site for the University of Montana's pioneering research into animal-assisted therapy for dementia patients. Richard had made the most dramatic adjustment, relocating his consulting business from Chicago to Missoula. He purchased the neighboring property, converting an old hunting cabin into a comfortable home office from which he could maintain his business while remaining close to his mother. His wife visited monthly, their children during school holidays, bringing new life to the once isolated homestead. Thomas Blackwood had perhaps undergone the most surprising transformation. After witnessing Ghost and Eleanor's reunion, he had requested reassignment to wildlife education and conservation. Now he served as the liaison between Fish and Wildlife and the university research team, his decades of field experience providing valuable perspective on Ghost's unique behaviors. "The property tax situation is finally resolved," Martha noted as she prepared Eleanor's lunch. "That conservation easement Richard arranged means you'll never have to worry about losing the cabin." Eleanor nodded, though such practical concerns increasingly existed at the periphery of her awareness. Her world had contracted to the rhythms of each day with Ghost, their morning walks when her mind felt sharpest, afternoon rest periods when confusion often descended, evening hours by the fire where Ghost would lie at her feet, a constant anchor to the present. She still used sticky notes, still had days when names slipped away, still sometimes believed Robert was just out checking the generator. But she never forgot Ghost, and he never let her wander too far, physically or mentally. Other seniors now visited the property under Martha's expanded role as program coordinator. The success with Eleanor had inspired a small but promising animal therapy initiative focusing on dementia patients. Not with wolves, of course. Ghost remained an exceptional case, but with specially trained dogs and occasionally other animals from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. When Richard arrived that afternoon, he brought not only the researchers, but also a journalist from a national science magazine working on a feature about innovative approaches to Alzheimer's care. "Mom's having a good day," he told the journalist as they approached the cabin. "But remember, no flash photography, and let her set the pace of the conversation." Eleanor sat on the porch, wrapped in a colorful quilt, Ghost at her feet. Her silver hair was neatly braided, her eyes bright with recognition as the small group approached. "There's my son," she said clearly. Then, with a mischievous smile, added, "and his entourage." The journalist asked thoughtful questions about Eleanor's experience, to which she responded with varying degrees of clarity. When she occasionally lost her train of thought, Ghost would nudge her hand gently, bringing her attention back to the present moment. Later, as evening approached and the visitors departed, Eleanor and Richard sat together, watching the snow begin to fall more heavily. Ghost lay between them, alert and content. "I won't always know you," Eleanor said suddenly, with the stark clarity that sometimes emerged. "That's coming. We both know it." Richard took her hand. "I know, Mom." "But I'll always know him," she continued, looking at Ghost. "And as long as I know him, I'll still be me, somewhere inside." As darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor Winters watched the snow with Ghost at her side. Two beings from different worlds, connected by something science could study but never fully explain. The profound simplicity of being known, being needed, being home. Have you ever wondered what it means to truly be seen? Eleanor's journey reminds us that healing connections can come from the most unexpected places. In a world where seniors often feel invisible, where our wisdom is overlooked and our struggles minimized, Eleanor and Ghost show us that profound understanding transcends all boundaries. Their story speaks to anyone who has felt the cold grip of isolation or feared losing touch with their own identity. It whispers hope that we are never too old for meaningful bonds, never too forgotten to be remembered, never too lost to be found. Like Eleanor, many of us face uncertain futures with courage, finding joy in each clear moment and purpose in caring for another being. The cabin in Montana isn't just a setting. It's a reminder that home isn't always a place, but rather where we are truly known. Where have you found unexpected connection in your life? What relationship has anchored you through difficult times? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be the very lifeline someone else needs to hear today. Remember, sometimes the most healing presence comes with no words at all.